On this edition of NTD's International Reporters Roundtable, collapsing birth rates. It's happening around the world, and the consequences could be devastating. Ghost towns, the elderly with nobody to care for them. The only way out is women having more babies, and soon. But the social messaging is the opposite. Save the planet, don't have children. Our guests Stephen Mosher, Stephen J. Shaw, and Steve Malloy join us to discuss the dangers of the looming population collapse. Welcome to NTD's International Reporters Roundtable. I'm your host, Cindy Drucare. In 1968, Paul and Ann Ehrlich published a bestseller, The Population Bomb, predicting imminent mass starvation due to overpopulation. The situation was so dire, they wrote, that adding temporary sterilants to the water could be a solution. At the time, the world's population was 3.5 billion people. Today, it's over 8 billion. And oddly, we're having a very different conversation. Elon Musk, by all accounts a very smart man, says that the problem today is not too many people, it's not enough people, and that plummeting birth rates across the globe poses a civilizational threat. And if people don't start having babies soon, civilization will crumble. Is it true? What about concerns that we're using up the Earth's resources? What about that more people means more pollution? Certainly birth rates are declining, but what does civilizational collapse even mean? Why are we in this situation, and what can be done? And if it's really so bad, why aren't we talking about it more? Well, today we are about to. Stephen Mosher is the president of the Population Research Institute. In 1979, Stephen was the first American social scientist to conduct research in China, where he saw firsthand coercive population control programs, and as a result has been a fierce critic ever since. He's an acclaimed speaker and author, including of the book Population Control, Real Costs, Illusory Benefits. Also with us is Stephen J. Shaw, a British national joining us from Japan. Stephen is a data scientist, demographer, and documentary filmmaker. 4 years of research into birth rate decline across the globe resulted in his very illuminating documentary, which I highly recommend, called Birth Gap: Childless World. His organization, birthgap.org, supports communities around the world preparing for the looming challenges ahead. Finally, Steve Malloy is a biostatistician and securities lawyer. Steve has been an energy company executive and a government advisor. He's the author of 6 books and the publisher of junkscience.com. Steve is currently a senior fellow at the Energy and Environmental Legal Institute, and this is his 3rd time on International Reporters Roundtable. Welcome back. Okay, welcome, Stevens. I'm gonna have to use your full names for this show. I want to start by understanding exactly what we're talking about, since as I mentioned in the intro, I think a lot of people don't realize that this is a problem. So Stephen Mosher, can you give us an overview of what we're seeing across the globe in terms of numbers? Where is birth rate decline the sharpest? Is it happening everywhere? Set the stage for us.
Well, first of all, let me say thank you for doing this show. It's very important for people to realize that humanity's long-term problem is not too many people, as we've been told for decades, but far too few, and the number is faster and faster. Elon Musk and I have something in common, by the way. He and I both have 9 children, so we're both doing our part to stave off the imminent population decline. I have 14 grandchildren now, hopefully a few more dozen on the way. But I wrote back in the 1990s in the pages of the Wall Street Journal that the same thing that Elon Musk is saying now, that without children, a country has no future, a family has no future. What happened is this. In 1800, the population of the planet reached about 1 billion for the first time, 1.5 billion a century later. After World War II, with the discovery of modern medicine, our population began increasing rapidly. From 1960 to 2000, the population of the world doubled from 3 billion to 6 billion. It didn't double because people were breeding like rabbits, like my former colleague at Stanford University, Paul Ehrlich, said. It happened because people stopped dying like flies due to the advent of modern medicine, which reduced infant and child mortality rates. And following that, of course, we always see the same thing happening, the demographic transition first of all, you see infant child mortality rates fall, and then a generation later, half a generation later, you see birth rates fall as parents adjust their fertility to the new reality that not half of their children are going to die before adulthood. So that is the demographic transition we've been going through. It's accelerated. We didn't stop at the magic 2.1 replacement rate fertility, where every woman has 2.1 children and the population reaches zero population growth and is stable forever. Instead, it kept on falling for reasons that have astonished, surprised, and puzzled demographers now for several decades. I think the three of us all know what the answer to the problem is, and I hope we get into the details of it.
Oh, we absolutely should. Steve Malloy, maybe you can just quickly, do you have the numbers on hand of what we're seeing in different countries?
I don't have numbers for specific countries. I can just tell you that, generally speaking, as the world gets wealthier and per capita income is going up around the world, people tend to have less children. And maybe it's because people are selfish or they don't need to have more children, but for whatever reason, as people get wealthier, they have fewer children. And we need to be at a point where people can get wealthier and want to have more children.
Okay, so Stephen Shaw, that brings me over to you. You spent 4 years researching this for your documentary, and you seem to have a faulty assumption at first that, families were getting smaller. That's not what you found. Tell us what you did find to put some meat on the bones for us about what this population or birth rate decline looks like.
Well, what was confusing me, what was confusing me back in 2016 was that these problems were being blamed on local factors. In Japan, it was work-life balance. In Southern Europe, it was high levels of youth unemployment. In Germany, it was some cultural things. Elsewhere, it was changes in popular culture. But for me, coming from the world of data science, given that this trend started in many of these places at the exact same moment in time, almost to the month, it made absolutely no sense that there were independent factors here. And yet demographers really hadn't either been looking for that or hadn't found a common factor. So I set myself a mission to try and find out if anything could be identified as being common. It took me a year and a half before I was in Japan, talking to a broad group of friends and asking them how many brothers and sisters they had. And I was asking the same question around the world. And I remember one person in Japan told me they were one of 8, and everyone else in the room had brothers and sisters. And then I asked some parents, and parents were clearly having 2 or more children in Japan. Now, the only way you can get a birth rate below 2.0 is if the majority of women are having either 0 or 1 child. So after that, I started to research the prevalence of one-child families. It's low. It's remained low. The reality is, if you look at motherhood across all of these nations, across decades, mothers are incredibly resilient. Mothers have been having the exact same number of children since the 80s. Or in Japan, mothers were having 2.3 children. Today, it's exactly the same. In the US, that's gone up from the mid-80s of 2.4 up to 2.6. This is not about motherhood. What has rocketed is levels of childlessness. From my research, most of that seems to be unplanned. It's through people simply drifting through life, perhaps assuming that the right person would come along or the right time would come along. And this connects every single one of these countries.
Well, we'll talk about more of that later, the causes, because that's really, the crux of what's going on here. But just to give the audience a sense of some of the numbers that we're actually seeing. So, as mentioned, we need 2.1, babies per woman to replace ourselves. And in the 70s, the world rate was over 5. And now the world rate is 2.3 and falling steadily. And I guess it's only in Africa that it's still, safely above that 2.1 level at 4.1, but it's also declining, and it was double, in the mid 20th century. And where is it, Stephen Mosher, just tell us where there's a few places, where is it the lowest right now?
Well, there's a real competition in this race to the bottom because fertility rates keep dropping everywhere. Singapore probably has the lowest fertility rate in the world, along with Hong Kong. We're talking about 0.7, 0.8 children per woman over her reproductive lifetime. But the other Stevens are perfectly correct in that the increasing rate of women who do not marry ever at any point in their life, or marry and have no children or at most one child is increasing, and that accounts for the falling birth rates everywhere. China is closely behind that. China claims to have 1.6 children per woman. It's probably down at 1.1 or 1.0 actually now. The Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, always manipulates, lies with statistics, presents numbers that make them look good and that are rosier than the actual picture. I know the Chinese birth rate is lower than the Chinese Communist Party claims because I was the first American social scientist in China back in 1979, 1980. I saw, instead of Paul Ehrlich's suggestion, following Paul Ehrlich's suggestion that you put chemical sterilants in the water, the Chinese Communist Party simply arrested women for the crime of being pregnant, took them in and sterilized them and aborted them if they happened to be pregnant. Numbers. And this is probably the world's biggest, well, undoubtedly, forced pace population control program, one of the most barbaric assaults on human dignity the world has ever seen. And it left in China 400 million unborn children dead, a couple 100 million women sterilized for life, and has produced, because of the combination of the one-child policy and the preference of the Chinese people for sons, it has left China with a very small cohort of young women in their reproductive years right now. So China's population is falling, is aging and dying more rapidly, I think, than any human population has aged and died. Europe, China, Latin America, all of the world has below replacement fertility now. And when you look at a place like India, which may be at 2.2, 2.3 now, you say, well, that's slightly above replacement. But it's not really, because any place with still fairly high infant child mortality needs more than 2.1 children. You need 2.3, 2.4, 2.5 to make up for those children who will be lost before they reach their reproductive years. So sub-Saharan Africa is the only bright spot in terms of fertility around the world. The rest of the world is in absolute population decline.
Okay, we're going to have to, sorry to interrupt, we're going to have to take a break now, and then we will be right back and we'll talk more about why this is even a problem, because a lot of people might think that's a good trend. Welcome back to NTD's International Reporters Roundtable. I'm your host, Cindy Drucker. We're going to go back to our panel where we're talking about declining birth rates. Steve Malloy, I'm going to come to you actually. What I want to understand why this is a problem, because a lot of people will think that this is a good thing. There's a carrying capacity to the earth. There's only so many resources. We're going to run out of resources and food. Isn't that an issue?
Well, I don't know that there is a carrying capacity. You know, Thomas Malthus thought there was a carrying capacity at the end of the 18th century. Paul Ehrlich, putting aside the fact that he's never been right about anything, thought that there was a carrying capacity in the 1960s, a point of view which he still has today, even though we have 8 billion versus 2 billion people. So I don't know that there is a carrying capacity. We have ample resources, ample energy, ample ways to grow food. We have plenty of technology, plenty of new technology that will come up. We're producing record amounts of food. We have record economic growth. We have more people living longer, healthier, wealthier, freer lives than ever before. There appears to be no limit. People, as I mentioned earlier, as people get wealthier, they sort of limit the number of children they have. I'm not sure what anybody is really worried about in terms of having more people, except what I work on mostly is the green agenda, and I know that the Greens, which Paul Ehrlich is one, they want to have many fewer people because they want to control everything, and it's easier to control everything if you have fewer people. Paul Ehrlich thought that number is about 2 billion or 1.5 billion maybe. I have seen recent information from the New York Times where they imagine by maybe the end of the century there could be dramatically fewer people on the planet. So I think we have, to summarize, we have plenty of resources. I don't understand what anyone who really thinks about it is worried about. I think we have the agenda-driven people like Ehrlich who don't really care what the facts are. They're the ones that are sort of driving this debate.
Right. I hear Elon Musk kind of repeat a lot. He says, it's an easy, there's no modeling required here. If you look at how many births we have today, we can tell exactly what things are going to look like in 20 years. So it's not even about modeling. The numbers are clear. Stephen Shaw, talk to us about what does this look like? What is civilization collapse? Why should we be concerned?
Yeah, and just to comment on the prior point, I mean, we're now in an age of a tailspin. We're going down. So anyone who was, up until watching this program, concerned about never-ending population growth can go and celebrate that for a few minutes. That battle's kind of been won. That's not the conversation anymore. And then come back and listen to the real challenges we now have on this planet, because they're all linked to population decline. Take South Korea right now, which this year the government's predicting a fertility rate of 0.6. 0.6, it's hard to imagine what that actually means. All of these fertility numbers are kind of opaque numbers that really are hard to kind of relate to for us all, and that's part of the problem. What that means for South Korea at that kind of birth rate is that births are going to halve every 20 years. Every 20 years. So by the time someone born in South Korea today, graduates high school, there's only going to be a need for half the number of kindergartens. And shortly after that, elementary schools will close. 40 years on, there'll only be enough for a quarter. Now, I lived there, spent a lot of time in Detroit, Michigan, 7 years, going through what at the time of its bankruptcy. And I think that's a perfect template we have here. Detroit is a template for what's going to happen across the planet when you have imploding communities, derelict cities, infrastructure that cannot be paid for, young people moving away because they want to live somewhere else. That will happen. We're going to see a much more nomadic society, from the young leaving the old behind. And while Detroit's problems were not linked to fertility decline, they were linked to rapid population decline. And the math's just the same.
Stephen Mosher, you know China well, and China is perhaps our best sort of template for what things look like. For 36 years, there was a one-child policy starting in 1979, then 2 children, 3. Now they're actually trying to encourage births. What do we see in China in terms of demographic, social, economic implications?
Well, we see China in absolute population decline, which is quite an accomplishment to take the world's most populous country and now reduce it. It's now in the number 2 position, by the way. India has overtaken China in population, total population, and India's population is still growing while China's is declining. That's why India's economic prospects are so much more brighter now than China's. China is facing a perfect storm of demographic collapse due to the aging and dying of the population, a shrinking workforce, a reduced number of young people coming into the workforce, buying homes and cars, starting businesses, looking to make long-term investments to drive the economy forward in the future. And at the end of the day, you have now what we see, what is being, we're seeing in major cities like Detroit in the United States, with the hollowing out of the city and the decline in the population, is happening all over China. You've got 65 million empty apartment buildings in China. You've got ghost cities in China, in part because they've overbuilt, but in part because the people who would have occupied those 65 million apartments, the young people who would have gotten married, had children, and purchased those apartments, are no longer around. They were killed in the one-child policy. And this has proved remarkably resistant to being reversed. The one-child policy ended in 2016. The Chinese Communist Party, in its ignorance, thought that all it had to do was end the one-child policy, and the birth rate would magically return to 2.1 replacement. It didn't. There was a tiny blip, and so 3 years later, Xi Jinping, the leader of China, declared everyone was now free to have 3 children. The Chinese people yawned. There are tens of millions of young people in China who will never marry and who will have no children because 40 years of antenatal propaganda have done their work. They regard children as a burden rather than a blessing.
Can you also add into that? We'll talk more about that absolutely soon. But can you add into your analysis what the impact is of lack of girl babies, right? Because we know that there was preferential selection for males. And I mean, same thing in India too. So how has that affected everything that you're talking about, or what extra burden has that added?
Well, it's a tremendous burden. There have been well over 100 million baby girls eliminated in China and India together due to sex selection abortion primarily, also female infanticide primarily in China, where couples who were desperate for a son again, to support them in old age, would simply abandon a little girl by the side of the road and leave her to die. That means that we have such a small cohort now of young women in China that every young woman in China would have to marry. If you crunch the numbers, you see that every young woman in China would have to marry at around the age of 21 and bear 3 children before the age of 30 before the current population decline in China could be stopped. That is simply not going to happen absent forced pregnancy, forced insemination, forced breeding of the population. Now, quite frankly, I wouldn't put that beyond either the capability or the intentions of the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, absolutely. The Chinese Communist Party, of course, forcibly aborted, forcibly sterilized hundreds of millions of women in the past. They would certainly have no moral compunctions about forcibly inseminating tens of millions of women in the future. It hasn't come to that yet, but in China, the Chinese Communist Party members, the young members, and the members of the People's Liberation Army have been told that they are to marry and have 3 children. Whether or not that will be extended to the population at large, we will see.
Let me break in here because I want to hear a bit more. Stephen Shaw, I want to ask you, we've had, and I want to talk more about the role of women later and how we've, denigrated the family. I know that's something you want to talk about, and we'll get to that in the next segment. But Stephen Shaw, I just want to ask you, we've seen mass depopulation events before, usually war, disease, famine, this kind of thing, and we recover. Why is this such a problem? Is there something categorically different about this, or is it just, and those were very difficult times, and we're going to have another very difficult time?
Yeah, and just to make the point, I can't speak about China. I don't have data in China. It's hard to get data in China. But to make the point, this is a global problem. This isn't just China. This is all of us. This is the US. This is Canada. This is Europe, Japan, etc. And it is India now. There are parts of India in the south with birth rates just as low as Europe and Japan, about 1.3 or 1.4 children per woman. So this is creeping up on us all. And, in terms of why it's happening, and, I think, in terms of role of women and men, what has happened, and it was triggered around the 1970s, around the time of the oil shock. Young people started to have families a bit later. And once that starts to happen, family forming starts to happen a little bit later, many people run out of time. And the biggest factor turns out to be not biology at that stage. It turns out to be not having a partner at the right time to have a child with. You don't have a boyfriend, you don't have a girlfriend, you're not married, or you're divorced, or you're in a breakup. And that started to creep in through the data decade by decade by decade. So now the statistic I can share is that in all of these countries, a woman turning 30 without a child has at best a 50% chance of ever becoming a mother. Wow. So we're living in societies now where more and more people are planning to start that family in their 30s, and half or more are running out of time.
Okay, well, we're going to stop here. When we come back, we're going to talk a lot more about the causes of all of this, since, as you said, they're similar across the board. So there's what's going on and what can we do to reverse it. We'll be right back. Welcome back to NTD's International Reporters Roundtable. I'm your host, Cindy Drucker, and we're back with our panel on population collapse with Stephen Mosher, Stephen Shaw, and Steve Malloy. We were talking before the break, getting into the causes, and I think the main thing that we have to talk about here is families and how children are viewed, how bearing children is viewed. I'll start with you, Steve Malloy, just bring you in here. What do we know about that in terms of how social policy, how social norms have impacted the role of women and having children, and what we're messaged about having children?
Well, of course, it's been incredibly important, especially in the West. I mean, we have been encouraging women to join the workforce at a very early age. And as a matter of fact, it's almost mandatory now if you want to have a decent standard of living. We've seen the development of birth control in the 1960s. Abortion came along in the 1970s. All these things work against population growth. And we have governments around the world that have been taken over by leftists who want less people. They've been scaring people about overpopulation. People, get wealthier, get more selfish, are happy where they are, don't need to have so many children. All these things have caused decline in birth rate, and of course in places like China where they've had the one child policy and that really hardcore discouraged having children. But in the West, we've done it a little bit more subtly, and we have just women have their prime fertility from late teens to about 30, as Steve mentioned earlier. And we're sticking them in the workforce, making them work, making it seem like they're failures if they don't work. Recently, the Kansas City Chiefs kicker gave a commencement address at a Catholic university where he talked about the importance of women being happy at home and being homemakers and how important a job that is. And he was just viciously attacked by the left-wing media in this country. And that's wrong. I mean, it is if you have any children, you know how difficult it is to raise them. And staying at home and raising your children well, that is quite a skill. It's a very important function, which is, in America, we just sort of discount and try to shame.
Stephen Shaw, I know that when you tried to show your film on university campuses, you encountered protests by feminists. What was their problem with your film?
Well, I don't know, because they actually never watched the film. It's quite remarkable that this topic just seems to be something that inflames a very small minority of people. It is a small minority. And if I could just share, I've been involved in a number of large-scale surveys, including one from the UK in the past few months, 1,500 women aged 18 to 35. Of those women, 92% either had children or wanted children. There's very similar data for the US from the large-scale CDC databases. But if you go to what's published on media, there's some, I would say, credible pollsters who ask very silly questions, and the media then extrapolates those. For example, one survey asked women aged 18 to 80 years old if they wanted children. I saw the raw results. One 60-year-old wanted 3 children, another 70-year-old wanted 2. Then the media publishes this result that more and more women aren't wanting children. It's simply not true, or it's very marginal. So there is this, I come from a non-political perspective, certainly in this question, because this clearly affects everybody. This affects people on the left, the right, and the center. And I care about everybody, but there are ideologies that are threatened by me and by this topic and by simply data. And it's very clear to me when, for example, you ask these people if they're concerned about South Korea, and they have no answer. They have no answer for countries that are going through an even deeper spiral. All they keep saying is fewer children, fewer children, fewer children. So these people will never be turned around. And I assume Paul Ehrlich is at the heart of this, directly or indirectly.
Stephen Mosher, we seem to be, there's a social trend where we're, devaluing, erasing women and womanhood as its biological function, of producing the next generation, of nurturing the next generation. We're, allowing biological men to claim womanhood, as we were talking about earlier, having, to be successful, you need to have a job. So the very essence of creating life is being devalued in society. Is that what you see as the driving force here? And if so, what does it look like to counter that?
Well, absolutely. The whole notion of womanhood is being fundamentally redefined to be something other than what it's been understood to be throughout the course of human history. I mean, we even have the Biden administration now referring to not to women, but referring to menstruators, because you see men can supposedly menstruate too. So this is the abolition of women and womanhood and mothering and all that goes along with it, which is one of the most difficult tasks on the planet. I mean, I am in awe of my wife, who has brought into the world all these many children and raised them and done a fantastic job. Her job is much more important than mine, certainly. But I would point here too to the question surrounding the economic value of children. You want to know why people are having fewer children? One of the reasons is that historically, children were economic assets to the family. You had them. After a few years, they began to work in the fields in a peasant society. They began to do household chores. They began to be economic assets from 6 or 7 or 8. You see that certainly in China 100 years ago. Now, of course, there are goods on which one loses, as the Chinese say, because you bring them into the world, you educate them through college. It costs a couple $100,000 to carry out this process, and then at the end of the day, when they get their job, they don't bring their first job. They don't bring their paycheck home to you. They open their own bank account, rent their own apartment, and leave. And then, of course, they're not responsible for supporting you in old age the way children throughout history have supported their parents in old age. So we've made children very expensive on the one hand, and we've severed the connection between the generations by putting the government in place of children for support in old age. Now, I'm not suggesting doing away with Social Security, but we have to find a way to relink the generations. And one way to do that is to shelter young couples who are willing to marry in their 20s and have children from taxes. They have one child, they pay a third less in federal income tax, two children, two-thirds less. Three children, if anyone is willing to bear three children and provide for the future of America in the most fundamental way by providing future children, they shouldn't have to be paying taxes because they're already using their resources to provide for the future of the country. That's what has to happen. We have to get the government out of the business of taking away half of a young couple's income in taxes and Social Security payment. That will help tremendously to raise the birth rate.
So, Steve Malloy, it sounds like what Stephen Mosher is just talking about, the government's kind of taken over the role of parenting. That's kind of led to these problems. Is that how you see it?
Well, yeah, no, it's really very bizarre because, you know, around the world, especially in the West, we have these ever expanding social welfare states, which cost a lot of money. And the only way that, you know, they're really affordable is if you have a larger generation of workers, productive workers coming online. And of course, we don't really have that anymore. And, you know, this sort of, you know, the left is, you know, I hate to politicize this, but it is a political issue because it is the left that is pushing these anti-people policies. You know, they want to have these broad social welfare programs, but they don't want to have the people, you know, that can fund them. And you must ask the question, well, do they not understand? And of course, they do understand because they're not stupid. They have the internet. They can think. They know that Paul Ehrlich has never been right about anything. They know Malthus was wrong. They know why they were wrong. They're not stupid people. They are purposely driving our society to collapse by making everybody poorer, promising benefits that cannot possibly be paid unless you have more productive workers. But then they're blocking those productive workers from being born. They're doing everything they can to do that.
Stephen Shaw, what kind of numbers would the people with this view like to see on the planet?
From my point of view, I think there are a few very clever people who have figured out that if we silently talk about things like the environment, gender gaps, pay gaps, all of those things, that a lot of people will not, because to many people those do sound like very credible things, and they'll be pulled into this world where they more and more delay having children. And what these really clever people, I think, have figured out is that many of those people will never become parents and therefore never grandparents, etc., etc. And the fastest way you could depopulate the planet would be by having more and more people having no children. And that's what the outcome has been. I think a lot of people, and I do talk to politicians on the right and the left, are absolutely shocked when you actually explain to them some simple mathematics about exponential decay. The fact that no matter how big or small your country is, that the race to the bottom is the same for all countries, you know, effectively in parallel. Total numbers don't matter here. So I'm not sure what the total target is. The only number someone ever confessed to me, it was an environmental professor wearing flip-flops, told me about half sounded right to him, but nobody else wanted to give me a real number. I don't know if there is a real number, but it's absolutely clear we're on the way down, and no nation in history has ever been known to come out of this spiral. I mean, this is the biggest crisis on the planet because there's no known solution.
And I can recommend to the audience seeing your film because you have some really great visuals of that. And you're showing people in the film and they get shocked when they see the visuals of it. I think it's a powerful representation. Okay, we're going to take a break now. And then when we return, we will conclude our panel on the coming population collapse. Welcome back to NTD's International Reporters Roundtable. I'm your host, Cindy Drucker, and we're returning to conclude our panel on the coming population collapse and to look at what could be done, what countries are trying to do. Stephen Shaw, I'll start with you again because I know you've been looking at Hungary, which is probably the one country that is trying the hardest to reverse this trend. Can you tell us what they're doing and is it working?
Yes, I've been to Hungary a number of times and I spent time with families in Hungary actually last month. Hungary has a swathe of policies. You arrive at the airport and as you walk off the plane, you see all these signs saying family-friendly Hungary, which I haven't seen anywhere else. Beyond that, they have 17 policies, including ones that help grandparents if they want to take over providing childcare so that the grandparents can earn a little bit of money for doing that. But actually, if you go through all of these policies, there's one policy that seems to have had an effect on younger people, and it's called Joko. Basically, if you're a young person and you commit to having a family and you commit to having, say, 2 children, you'll be given a loan to help you buy a house or to renovate a home. And if you actually say 3 children, you'll get a bigger loan, and 4 children, an even bigger loan beyond that. And that's the maximum. Now, if you actually end up having those children, the loan is forgiven because you've done your duty in terms of what Hungary wants, which is having future people to help sustain and grow the country, I guess. And it's certainly the case. I met 2 families, one who moved to a much larger home outside Budapest. That wouldn't have happened. They had their 3rd child sooner than they would otherwise have done. And another family, renovated their home and was able to effectively do the same thing. So it may be that helping people onto the property ladder in some way may be the one thing that has an effect. But just to be clear, around the world, every other policy we've seen really has had minimal or effectively zero effect.
Steve Malloy, what about immigration? Can that help? I know in America, so birth rates are declining, but immigration is increasing. The population isn't declining for that reason. Can immigration help?
Well, I think immigration is just moving people around. I mean, we are, in the United States, we are fooling ourselves by allowing this, mass immigration to take all these, jobs that Americans don't want to do. We're not reproducing at nearly enough, but we're sort of maintaining the illusion that our population is fine by allowing mass immigration. I just want to say, one of the important drivers of this phenomena is that, people have been scared that we're running out of resources. The only resource we're running out of really is people. We have plenty of energy. We have plenty of space to grow food. We're not running out of fossil fuels. We've got plenty of nuclear power. If you want to have wind and solar, then we have even more fossil fuels. We grow so much food, we burn it for energy. So, there really is no reason to try to, we have plenty of space. There's no reason to try to unnaturally constrain the population. We need to get back to the point where we're encouraging people to have children. We should, limit immigration, keep it legal, and encourage people to have children because there's plenty of resources for everyone.
So, Stephen Mosher, what do you think are ways that can be encouraged? I know you're not a big fan of the government stepping in and doing a whole lot, but what do you think will work?
Well, I think that what will work is getting the government out of the equation. Governments in modern social welfare states take half or more of a young couple's income in various taxes. Now, I applaud Hungary. I think Hungary's a success case. It has brought its total fertility rate up from about 1.1 over the last few years to 1.6. But note this, 1.6 is still well below, it's half a child below the 2.1 they need. And over the last couple of years, the increase in the total fertility rate seems to have plateaued. So Hungary has been more successful than any other country, but I don't think it is a template for bringing us back to even a plateau of fertility at 2.1, much less increasing it beyond that and encouraging population growth. I think what you have to do is not take away young couples' income and then give it back to them as Germany does in little stipends of Kindergeld, child money. You have to get the government out of the way entirely and recognize that young couples who are investing in children are investing in the future of America. In other words, they're raising future taxpayers will go on to support the social welfare programs, who will support Social Security. Every 0.1 increase in the total fertility rate in the United States extends the lifetime of Social Security trust fund by another 3 years. So the two are intimately related. That is my suggestion. And my fellow Stevens are perfectly right in everything they've said. Fertility delayed is fertility denied. There are tens of millions of young women on the planet who would like to have two or two and a half or three children, who have been frustrated by the fact of not being able to find a partner or not feeling financially secure enough to act on their fertility desires. So we're not telling women they must bear children against their will. We're making it possible for them to bear the children that they would like to have in an ideal world.
Stephen Shaw, looks like you
And
want to
can I
jump
just
in,
say,
please.
just to say, this is the good news here. It would be a much different case if it was a case that people don't want children anymore. Then we'd have to be kind of preparing for the end of civilization. Yeah, there's hope here. And the hope I get is showing the documentary to younger people, 12-year-olds in Japan, college-age students in the US and UK. Young people are shocked by this. They don't know yet that they might not have the children they want to have because we're going to put them on this path of constant working and education. I think young people will have the answer for their own lives and resequence their priorities, frankly, in a way that we're not encouraging them yet to do.
Stephen Shaw, do you think, well, I'll get to you second, Stephen Malloy, but Stephen Shaw, I just want to ask you a follow-up. Do you feel like in Hungary, the culture is changing around the idea of having families, or does it feel like a government-imposed policy?
This was surprising to me. I went to several events there actually linked to family, and I thought I would feel coercion, but there was none. It was just a lot of people who felt comfortable talking about the families they want to have, or the older people that they want to bring into their communities and care about, or the single mothers that they worry about too. It was quite astounding to me just how natural it felt there.
Great. All right, Stephen Lloyd, jump in.
Yeah, so in the United States, the government is propagandizing children not to have children. We are scaring the bejeebers out of kids about the environment and the climate and all that. We call people pollution. We call carbon dioxide, which is necessary for life on the planet, pollution, and we are just scaring kids. And there is a you read about it in the Washington Post, New York Times. There's a real no child movement. People are being scared into not having children because of supposed gloom and doom from global warming, climate change, what have you. It's total nonsense. It's wrong. We need to get the government to stop doing that. If people should be encouraged to have children, not scared away from it.
So this seems like a very steep hill to climb, because all the messaging is around, the problem with the environment, and too many people creates more pollution. So Stephen Malloy, what do you see as, can make documentaries and talk to young people in college, but do you see any, seems like we need a bigger shift more quickly. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, we need a huge shift, but it's very difficult to turn this ship around when you have this government which is biased against people. You have the media which is biased against people, the elites in America which run every institution. The left has captured every institution in America. They are biased against people. We have allowed this to happen. People have just sort of been asleep at the wheel, enjoying their wealth, while politically motivated people have been capturing institutions for their own political agenda. And that's got to change. What's the answer to that? Well, I think we're seeing it sort of play out in real time in 2024. But people need to be more aware of what's at stake, what's been happening, what the plan is for the future. And the plan for the future is far fewer people.
Okay, we're just about done, so I'd like to get everybody's final thoughts, either a final thought you want to leave us with, or your best prognosis for where all of this goes. Stephen Shaw?
I think societies, employers, education establishments have to actually work together to enable young people to have the children they want to have at the time they want to have them. There's a lot of vulnerability on young people, particularly women, to step out of the career path and worry about not getting back on it. Young people have got a lot more power than they realize because they're in shrinking numbers. So I think all coming together is the way to solve this.
Interesting. And Stephen Mosher?
Well, people need to understand that they have been deceived by the myth of overpopulation for the last few decades. And they need to understand that our real crises here, which we've emphasized again and again in this great discussion is not too many people, but too few people, not too many children, but too few children. And that we are humanity is close to being in a death spiral where the population decline will be almost irresistible and irreversible if we don't act now to create a more family and child and baby friendly society.
Let me ask you, actually, as you say, it might almost irreversible, because I need to ask this. Is there a point at which it's too late, because there aren't actually, I mean, they'd have to have, we wouldn't have to have 10, 12 children, in order to get the population back up there. So has that modeling been done? Stephen Mosher.
Well, yes, and quite frankly, it wouldn't take. We're not talking about every woman getting married and every woman having exactly 2.1 children, which is impossible biologically anyway. We're talking about allowing young women to act on their natural fertility desires, and if there are some young women who, as Buckner suggested, want to devote their lives to raising children, having children and raising children, creating a family, we should allow them to do that. And if 10% or 15% of the population is willing to have large families, and I mean 5, 6, 7, 8 children, that will offset those who voluntarily choose not to have any.
All right, we've got to wrap up. 10 seconds for you, Steve Malloy. Any final word?
Yeah, look, I think people need to spotlight folks like Paul Ehrlich, who have never been right about anything. Their whole rationale for limiting population has just been incorrect. It's been proven time and time again. And that's what I do on a daily basis. I try to expose these people and target rather their reputations.
All right, we've got to stop there. Well, that concludes our discussion today. I want to thank you, gentlemen, very much. It's been extremely interesting. Thank you, Stephen Mosher, Steve Malloy, and Stephen Shaw. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Finally, to all of you brave journalists out there honoring our golden rule, seek the truth and report it. Thank you. I'm Cindy Drucker. Thank you for joining us on NTD's International Reporters Roundtable. Until next time.